Dementium 2 HD is a remake to a sequel of a video game that I normally would never have touched because of my general disgust towards all things horror. But because I gave Dementium the Ward and Dementium Remastered a try, and ultimately found them, let's just say, bearable, I did the same with Dementium 2 on the Nintendo DS. But just like with my last review, I'm covering the HD Remaster because that's the version I ultimately chose to play on my main channel. Anyway, a lot of what I said about Dementium Remastered carries over to Dementium 2 HD, so expect some reworded cut and paste, but it's not the lazy kind of cut and paste, which is what EA does and still fucking gets away with. I will cut open Dementium 2 HD with the bloody scalpel, harvest and inspect its organs, and determine if they're healthy enough for a transplant or not. Dementium 2 HD is an HD remix of Dementium 2 for the Nintendo DS. The original version of Dementium 2 was developed by Renegade Kid, published by South Peak Games, and released in the US on May 4th, 2010. That's 2 days after my birthday, 3 days before Iron Man 2 released in theaters, and the birthday of Deirdre, my favorite Animal Crossing villager. The HD version was developed by Mimetic Games, published by Digital Tribe Games, and released on PC and Steam on December 17, 2013. That's 6 months after my birthday, 1 month after Thor the Dark World stumbled into theaters, and 3 days after China put a rover on the moon.
对于人类而言，这是一小步；对于人类而言，这是一大飞跃。
Compared to the first game, the sequel is seen as an improvement. The same can't exactly be said for Dementium 2 HD. More on that later. The two defining genres of this game, first-person shooter and survival horror, are still intact. Control-wise, you use a mouse instead of a touchscreen for aiming, and the WASD keys for moving. There are also a few new moves that you weren't able to do in the first Dementium game. You're able to jump, crouch, and dual-wield certain weapons, alongside the all-important flashlight. Hallelujah! A lack of a second screen means that you'll play this game the old-fashioned way, with only one screen. Bringing up the menu allows you to see your inventory of items, which includes the ludicrously helpful addition of being able to stockpile health pickups that you can use at any given time. You don't have a notepad to write notes down, but you can store documents and maps that you find. And as far as save points go, they also replenish your health, a feature that I would recommend abusing, given that enemies don't respawn after you kill them, except for one type of enemy, unfortunately. Lastly, most weapons from the first Dementium game return for the sequel, except for the nightstick, sniper rifle, and magnum pistol, which you honestly won't miss. Replacing the nightstick is a bladed shank, or ceremonial dagger, and as far as new weapons go, you can wield a sledgehammer, dynamite, a flamethrower, a nail gun, and a mysterious relic. Your options for vanquishing enemies as you progress through the game are surprisingly plentiful, which is good because the sequel seems to favor combat much more than the original. When you first start Dementium 2 HD, you'll notice the improved quality of the cutscene visuals. The nurse character looks well detailed, the hand that you groggily focus on is well textured, and the institution that you're stuck in is plain and adequate. When you're teleported into the Plains of Anguish for the first time, there are some horrifying details that highlight the mature nature of Dementium 2 HD. Metal structures, spiked fences, dark green skies, and doors sealed with magical symbols. The monsters that you encounter here also appear in the real world, often with little warning. In comparison to the first game, you're not stuck in a hospital, which subsequently means that there's a bit more variety in the environments for the sequel. The Bright Dawn treatment center that you're in has prison cells, outdoor facilities, and an anxiety-inducing boiler room to trek through. A claustrophobic tunnel connects this facility to Pelf Village, which is unsettlingly deserted. There's also a mineshaft to explore. All of these areas take place in a snowy day, in stark contrast to the stormy night of the first game, when you're not in a derivative of hell anyway. Naturally, the sound design of Dementium 2 HD is an improvement to both Dementium games on the Nintendo DS, and Dementium Remastered on the Nintendo 3DS, and just like with the first entry, you will want to wear headphones to immerse yourself into the atmosphere. From a character standpoint, there's certainly more dialogue, especially with the bad doctor. If I recall correctly, Jules Watsham, one of the two founders of Renegade Kid, lends his voice to the doctor, and while he's by no means a professional voice actor, he does an adequate job in lending his voice to this remastered indie game. The enemies in this game all have distinct sounds to them as well. Loud groaning, metal tinking, laughing, shrieking, squealing, spitting, wailing, roaring, scuttling, chattering. It's all there and will most likely make you jump a few times, while guaranteeing that you tread carefully to locate the source of these sounds. The weapons also sound authentic, disregarding the fictitious nature of the mysterious relic. My previous critique of the machine gun sound effect doesn't hold true here, as it sounds rather accurate and doesn't make me question it. Lastly, the soundtrack and ambience of this game is a natural improvement overall. The background music in and of itself isn't award-winning or well-crafted by any means, but there is more variety to these tracks. It does change when you encounter an enemy though, which you can use to your advantage, or turn off if you have much bigger balls than me. Regardless of that, the ambience will fool you at first into thinking there are enemies or other types of activities going on in the background that warrant investigating, but once you've heard glasses breaking and footsteps pitter-pattering for the upteenth time, you'll learn that there's no weight to them. The visual and indirect storytelling of Dementium 2 HD is just as prevalent as it was in the last entry. If anything, there's significantly more story to be told, but it involves reading several documents, experiencing many grotesque horrors, and listening to several and slightly charming lines of dialogue from the Doctor. It's also broken down into 5 chapters this time around, rather than 16, each one taking roughly an hour to complete if you take your time. Expect some spoilers right now, especially if you don't have the cojones to play this game. Chapter 1 begins with you waking up with the nurse inspecting you, before saying that you need to be moved. As you're being escorted down the halls, you see that you're in the Bright Dawn Treatment Center, where Russians are imprisoned for some reason. You also see a nurse in an elevator, your wife surrounded by blood. The cell you're stuck in, outside of some rather suggestive images, and a poster of a woman who's a furry's best friend, has a postcard that sets hell itself into motion. A dimension where satanic monsters are trying to seep out into the real world, a figment of your unstable imagination that got you here in the first place? Could be both, could be neither. Same goes for the Gnaw, which practically swallows this poor fellow whole. Either way, whatever experience you're on, it breaks you out and leads you to the first boss of the game. After making a prison bitch out of land jaws, you trek through the boiler room and through a tunnel, starting Chapter 2 in Peef Village. This barren village, sans monsters you must fight your way through, house clues to your wife Elizabeth and your daughter Amanda, who we never see in this game. What we do see is a doll that is dug from a grave and brought to a church. This triggers a boss fight with the Wendigo Witch, who changes herself to be your wife. Or perhaps she is your wife, especially when you kill her. Hard to say for certain. Regardless, your reward is a ceremonial dagger and a return trip to the Bright Dawn Treatment Center, which starts Chapter 3. The Doctor is always watching you apparently, making that clear through his monologues. And there are hulking monsters to kill, like this one that clotheslines this poor soul. You find notes in lore about the worst monster of all though. A serpent trapped in the lower levels of the Plains of Anguish, Malatesta, a malicious beast of immense power that, if it is let loose into the real world, becomes invincible. Just ask SpongeBob SquarePants.
It was big! It was all wiggly! And it ate everything!
Wait, so does that make the Gorgamesh Patrick Star?
Nobody calls me dummy!
Anyway, Chapter 4 predominantly takes place in a mine shaft, but instead of fighting creepers and cave spiders, you fight banshees and reanimators. Oh, and the Gorgamesh again. Twice! If that proves too tiresome, you can relax and listen to the radio. It's got your favorite tunes, and it's just plain good for you. The Doctor says so himself.
This is an emergency broadcast, William, and as you should have learned by now, it's always a test.
You know what's also good for you? Dynamite, especially when you ingest it. So when you fight the Colossus, feed it as much dynamite as possible. It'll practically blow away all of that fat. The 5th and final chapter grants you a mysterious relic that you've been piecing together to this point. With it, you're able to return to the treatment center, fight through the monsters in the Plains of Anguish, and defeat the Doctor once and for all. Sadly, he's in a lot of SpongeBob SquarePants, and summons the Alaskan bullworm as the final boss. In felling this monster, and saving Bikini Bottom, you're free to go. No longer considered mentally unstable, but the final cutscene of this game has other ideas. Amazingly, only a few enemies from the first Dementium game return for this sequel, and just like last time, I will rate these enemies in terms of their fear factor from a scale of 1 to Flamethrower. Crying Banshees are honestly harmless, and may make you question what made these enemies fucking terrifying in the first game. They don't fly straight towards you, they just float lazily at you, they have no means of attacking you, and attempt to blind you with an ink-like substance. They don't even shriek, so the whimpering comes across as pathetic. They're about as effective as the bloopers in Mario Kart basically, but they do have a sister counterpart. Flying insects appear in only a few moments in the game, meaning that they hardly even need to be in the game. They just fly towards you and attempt to hurt you, but you're likely gone shortly after seeing them. Frostbites are exclusive to the HD version of Dementium 2, and are the souls of people that perished from listening to Disney's Frozen's Let It Go too many times. They float around and deal damage, I think. The cold never bothered me anyway. These enemies probably won't bother you too. They don't normally appear after the second chapter anyway. Locked souls are much more common than their icy counterparts and will stalk you in the boiler rooms mostly. Spectres of Black, with eyes of 6, they will instantly transport you into the planes of anguish if they make contact with you. Either run from them to prevent this, or shine the light of the mysterious relic at them to keep them away from you. Slime mines are floating balls of chained gas with eyes on them, harmless from a distance, dangerous if they get too close to you. Simply shoot them on sight and you won't have to breathe in their toxic fumes. The worms return from the first game, but have obviously been aborted to the point of becoming an endangered species. Those that remain are easy pickings for your shank. They don't even cry anymore, as if they welcome death. Chest maws also make their return, and are the most common enemy that you'll encounter. This time around, they've been given the Darth Vader treatment, and are easily distinguished by their metallic footsteps. Cut, shoot, or smash their hearts, and you should have very little to worry about. They don't even run towards you or spit at you from afar anyway. Guards uphold the law, and appear in the Bright Dawn Treatment Center above all else. They will mostly attempt to smack you with police-issue stun batons, or try to shoot you with assault rifles from a distance. Return the favor, and make them question if they should quit after that one guy got clobbered by a Gorgamesh. Aerial hunters are floating hot air balloons with little buzzsaws on the ends of their tails. They're unusual enemies at best, but not terribly difficult to kill. If you're patient with them, you can pummel them with a sledgehammer, and after killing them, be sure to abort their babies afterward. Yes, this is where those worms were coming from. Reanimators are late-game fungal-like enemies that appear dangerous and formidable at first, but that's only because you don't yet have the flamethrower to properly kill them. They are most dangerous from a distance and relatively slow overall. Just ignore them until you have the means to burn them to death later in game. Spitters are annoying enemies that taunt you by laughing and rolling away when you hurt them. What can make these enemies dangerous is that they spit poison at you from a distance. They take more physical abuse than most other enemies, meaning that they have plenty of time to poison you back. The antidotes you might pick up make you immune to their poison for a short period of time, but you're better off strafing and shooting away at them while keeping an eye on the poison puddles they leave behind. Regular Banshees are almost exactly like the Banshees from the first Dementium game. This time though, they can temporarily deafen you and explode when dying. Fortunately, they don't appear as often as other enemies, and sadly they don't even shriek the same way as before. Oh, what a relief. But they do keep you alert by respawning in areas that they float around when you revisit. Lastly, brain hoppers are brains with mouths and long claws attached to them. These enemies are probably the most hostile of regular enemies, just from the way that they move, which makes aiming at them somewhat difficult. They will always move towards you, so melee weapons are your best bet in taking them down. They're not the strongest of enemies, but they are the most erratic. And they never shut up, always making their ear-piercing screeching sounds. That makes them pretty damn scary in my book. It's worth noting that the Nintendo DS version of Dementium 2 was comparably well received as Dementium the Ward. Both Nintendo DS Dementium games have Metacritic scores in the 70s, which is rock solid for a video game, but the remakes are a different story, and if you ignore the fact that there aren't as many reviews to both remakes to get a proper aggregate score, you have to wonder what it is about these remakes that makes them feel inadequate to their original version. Well, given that I've played both Nintendo DS Dementium entries and both of their remakes, I think the reason why the DS versions are considered superior are because they're Nintendo DS games. There's an obvious limitation with the Nintendo DS as far as controls and graphics go, but the console is called the Nintendo DS for a reason, and it has sold over 150 million units for a reason. The DS stands for Developer System after all. The best Nintendo DS games and developers make the most out of these limitations by introducing some unique video games that are only possible on the Nintendo DS. That's why Dementium the Ward and Dementium 2 on the Nintendo DS are seen as impressive indie titles. Their graphics are some of the best on the humble little handheld, the gameplay is effective, and the frame rate is virtually seamless. The gimmick of the flashlight with both titles is also unique, which certainly makes these two games genuinely scary. Dementium 2 HD has all of this, except for the fact that it's on PC and not on Nintendo DS. What was once seen as technically impressive on older hardware is now seen as technically inadequate on ever-evolving hardware. This game came out in 2013, the same year as BioShock Infinite and Final Fantasy XIV, the good one. This game is also currently available for only $2 on Steam, while the original DS version is slowly becoming a collector's item. I suppose this is why people label Dementium 2 HD as a demaster instead of a remaster, especially when some of these character models look relatively unchanged from the Nintendo DS title. Yes, despite this game's aging flaws and an HD port that probably does some things worse than the original version, I can think of worse things to spend $2 on.
No, come back on $2! $2! No!
The combat is on the slow and clunky side when switching and reloading weapons, which can get irritating when you realize that the sequel certainly has more mandatory combat in it than in the first game. There are also some bugs and glitches in this game. I didn't experience any game-breaking bugs that would warrant a full restart, but I did have one instance of my game crashing in the middle of Chapter 4, which thankfully didn't corrupt my gameplay footage. Good job, Action Marillis! There's also some graphical hiccups, and one instance of a hellish enemy ascending into heaven. Ultimately, I don't think this game is as bad as people say. It could have been a lot more than a Nintendo DS game with HD graphics though. It's just enough, given my distaste of horror games. I just wish it had a smoother frame rate. I mean honestly, 1920 by 1080p on a Surface Book 2, and it can't handle that? Come on.
Just what I need. Another little bald guy.
Pac-Man's moving up to a whole new world. Pac-Man World 20th Anniversary in 3D. The star's big new adventure.
PlayStation